I've noticed over the years that an awful lot of people dislike having aspects of everyday life being described in objective terms, stripped away of falsehood, sentiment, and cant. I'm fascinated by this reluctance to talk about ordinary life and examine the real nature of what we are doing from day to day. A good example of this is, of course, work, which most of us are obliged to undertake for many decades in order to keep body and soul together. Nobody, though, welcomed an honest appraisal of this part of our lives. It is tricked out in more deception than almost any subject of which I can think. The truth is that few of us wish to dwell upon the grim reality of what jobs actually entail and prefer to trick out our colleagues and even our boss as friends and pretend that we work because we like it, rather than it simply being a way of avoiding homelessness and starvation. Let's now think about what work actually involves and then look at the mythology which has grown up around it and now obscures its essential nature from view. One way in which your average person manages to get around facing up to the problems which work presents in the modern world is by talking about it in terms of service, devotion, loyalty, and friendship, as though the average workplace was similar to a medieval monastery. This strange way of looking at things is common from high ranking civil servants to the humblest worker in a warehouse. Instead of seeing themselves as working for a living and making as much money out of the activity as they are able, there's a tendency to downplay this distasteful mercenary aspect and emphasize other, supposedly more important features of what they do. Consider Britain's former Director of Public Prosecutions, Alison Saunders. As a barrister, she spent decades working for various agencies as a prosecutor before landing the top job in the country, a DPP, with a salary of £230,000 a year, 80,000 a year more than the Prime Minister. When Alison Saunders retired from the role of Director of Public Prosecutions in 2018, there was, for reasons which need not concern us, controversy about whether she should be appointed Dame, the traditional reward for those leaving this job. She claimed indignantly that she had, and I quote, dedicated over 30 years to public service. Now, somebody who's been donating her time as a voluntary first aider might claim to have dedicated herself to public service. A woman who's been drawing a salary of £230,000 a year has simply been doing an exceptionally well paid job. This is work rather than public service. It is this fantasy, the hope that one's job will be viewed by others as being dedicated to this or that lofty aim, rather than merely as a good way to pay the mortgage, that many people indulge in. At a lower level, workers in many institutions and companies try to give the impression that they too are not working for money, but rather other intangible and less crude benefits than merely financial. In advertisements for Amazon a couple of years ago, employees working in warehouses were filmed saying things like, I work here because I like the people, and if I didn't enjoy what I was doing, I wouldn't be here. For these people, the love of their fellow members of the human race or the sheer enjoyment of stacking shelves provided the primary motive to stay in their jobs. No mention was made of the wages they were being paid. Pretending that you're going to work every day because you're serving the public, love your workplace, or find your fellow employees exceptionally congenial are part of a general attempt by wage slaves to hide from themselves the true nature of their lives. One cannot blame anybody for doing this. Nobody likes to reflect on the uncomfortable truth that most of us only get up in the morning and go to work because if we didn't, then we and our children would go hungry. To avoid facing the blunt reality, which is that we are compelled to trudge to our place of work each day under the threat of poverty and hardship, it's little wonder that many of us try to present ourselves more in the light of selfless servants of the public or gregarious souls who love their jobs because of the opportunities which they give us to socialize with our friends, which is how we see our workmates or colleagues. Properly to understand what is going on here, we might begin by clearing the ground a little and thinking about the nature of paid employment in general, regardless of the type of work done. Most of us who work are either employers or employees. The first thing to remember is something which should be fairly obvious, but is frequently forgotten or hastily brushed under the carpet, that the needs and wishes of employees and employers are irretrievably and diametrically opposed. This is the case no matter how we might try to hide the fact by claiming that our boss is a really good person with whom we enjoy excellent relations. His or her aims are still, despite the superficially pleasant relationship we maintain, still violently opposed to our own. This is just as much the case with hospitals as it is with factories, with department stores, as with schools, bus companies, shipping lines, charitable foundations, multinational conglomerates, or any other enterprise with employees of which one cares to think. The fundamental opposition of aims and intentions forms one of the chief driving forces in the lives of almost everybody, and yet is seldom remarked upon. It is a dialectical process where two mighty imperatives clash and bring forth innumerable compromises, and our ability to buy food and pay the mortgage or rent depends on the eventual outcome of such compromises. This background to our lives is scarcely acknowledged, and indeed most of us try not to think about it at all. As employees, we wish to have as much money as possible for doing as little work as we can get away with. Ideally, we would be paid £1,000 an hour for doing next to nothing. Employers have quite a different perspective on this. In their case, they wish to get as much work from their employees as they can manage while paying them the least amount of money. Their ideal scenario would be for their employees to work like dogs for 100 hours a week at a rate of 10 pence an hour. This is, of course, why so many companies outsource their production to less economically developed countries. It's far easier to get people to work a 100-hour week for 10 pence an hour in Thailand or the Philippines than it is in Western Europe. Since nobody in his or her senses wishes to give away money, and most of us want as much money as we can lay our hands on, there's bound to be some conflict between the interests of these two very different groups, those of employers and workers. Because the actual nature of the situation is seldom spoken of out loud, those wishing for more money for less work, in the case of the employees, or more money for less work, or more work for less money, I should say, in the case of the employers, they typically trick out what they are doing in fancy terms designed to conceal what they are really up to. Money is a vulgar word and often avoided in polite company. We speak instead of income, salary, funding, resources, remuneration, compensation, and so on. It sounds so much better when an organisation is trying to put the right on the government to obtain more money, to refer instead to chronic underfunding or a lack of resources. The shortage of money becomes a funding crisis, and somebody hoping to persuade a former employer to give him a large sum of money due to some injury suffered in the workplace is said to be seeking compensation. For their part, employers wishing to get staff to back off from pay claims will put the frighteners on them by threatening them with wholesale sackings. Not that anybody would dream of putting such a plan in those words. It sounds much better to talk of restructuring or rationalisation. Here then is an important point which so many of us do our best to forget. We don't go to work because of our devotion to some ideal or because we like those with whom we work. We do it because we have to in order to survive. Deep inside, we know this and we feel resentment. This resentment is felt by both bosses and workers. The bosses resent the fact that their employees are lazy and greedy, and ordinary workers feel bitter that they are being exploited as wage slaves. What is truly extraordinary is that neither group openly admits any of this, even to themselves. Instead, they fight a guerrilla war against each other, each struggling for advantage over the other. The rules of the game, though, dictate that neither side can ever come out and say what they really mean. Employers claim to cherish their staff while the workers declare their loyalty to their company. The nature of this constant struggle is such that every single person in employment steals and engages in fraud. This dishonest behaviour takes place at all places of work, and because nobody ever calls it by its correct name, it's likely to come as a shock to many viewers see the actual nature of what they get up to set out in this way in a plain and unadorned fashion, no attempt to conceal unpalatable facts. Now, I'm rather guessing that when I suggest that the average person in Britain uses fraud in this way at his or her place of work regularly and for amounts typically in excess of £1,000 a year, there'll be predictable howls of outrage. I'll come back to this staggering lack of awareness shortly. Let's carry out a simple thought experiment first. Imagine, if you will, that you hire somebody to do work around your property. Perhaps it's some gardening which needs to be done or cleaning. You hand over £100 and agree a day when the work is to be done. When the time comes, the man you engaged doesn't turn up as agreed because he preferred to spend the day with his girlfriend, or perhaps to stay in bed watching a football match, or some other selfish and irresponsible reason. Nevertheless, you hire him to do other work, but the £100 paid for that first day's work is lost and forgotten. Over the course of time, he does exactly the same thing, at least half a dozen times a year. That is to say, he takes your money and doesn't do the work you paid for. This is as plain a case of fraud as you could hope to find. The idiomatic expression throwing a sickie is common throughout the United Kingdom, Australia, and New Zealand. On average, each British worker annually takes 9 days sick leave. That is to say, almost a fortnight's worth of working time a year. Although some of these people are genuinely ill, the great majority are not. They are throwing a sickie, which is to say, feigning sickness in order to cheat their employer out of a day or more's wages. To lend verisimilitude to these deceptions, those committing this fraud often put on a croaky voice, pretend to cough, and then appear at work after their time off looking as unwell as can be managed. The purpose of the whole imposture is to trick their employers out of a few £100s, the money which will be paid to a healthy employee who doesn't feel like doing any work that day. The average wage in the United Kingdom is perhaps £500 a week. This means that somebody taking a day off work for a non-existent illness has cheated his or her employer out of £100. Most of those watching this video will have thrown a sickie at some time, but possibly they have done so regularly. The internet is full of material relating to this practice, including YouTube tutorials advising people about the best way to persuade their fellow workers that they are genuinely ill as a prelude to defrauding their employer. The whole subject is treated in a light-hearted way as though it's all a great joke. Newspapers and magazines routinely carry amusing articles about avoiding being caught out when undertaking such deceptions. The fascinating thing about fraud of this kind, which according to the Confederation of British Industry costs billions of pounds each year, is that none of the otherwise respectable people committing the crime acknowledge even to themselves that they are criminals. Of course, cheating and fraud are not the only kind of crime in which the average respectable person indulges. One of the humorous newspaper articles about throwing sickies of the kind mentioned above appeared in the British publication The Scotsman on the 5th of February 2012. Although the title of the piece was intended to provoke a smile, it was called Not to be Sneezed at, The Etiquette of Throwing a Sickie. The content is genuinely shocking. The tone of the thing makes it very clear that not only fraud but theft is condoned, although the language is artfully manipulated to conceal this awful fact. After casually discussing the estimated £2.7 billion lost to the 30 million fraudulent days off each year, the writer with breathtaking candour had this to say. Judging by the number of internet sites dedicated to boasting about it, skiving is seen by many as on a par with taking envelopes from the stationery cupboard. In this context, Taking an envelope from the stationery cupboard refers to stealing office supplies. In other words, fraud and theft are made to sound innocuous by being concealed behind the weasel words "driving" and "taking." Of course, employers have their own way of getting back at employees in this constant guerrilla warfare. They use rather different methods, but they still entail cheating people and stealing from them. Perhaps readers who have ever been guilt-tripped or coerced into working past their usual going-home time could raise their hands. I suspect that this will include almost everybody watching this. Just as when a healthy worker throws a sickie, this is a way of scamming people, stealing their time by making them read emails when they're not at work, among other things. Which brings us to the second reason for examining in some detail the practice of throwing sickies. It was said earlier that employers and their staff are constantly engaged in fighting an undercover war against each other, and employees cheating their boss out of money or employers trying to get their staff to work for nothing are both skirmishes in this conflict. Once in a while, somebody gives the game away and tells things as they are about the world of work, but this is rare. In October 2015, journalist Suzanne Moore published an opinion piece in the Guardian newspaper with the headline, "Phone in sick, it's a small act of rebellion against wage slavery." Other than such occasional lapses into truthfulness, though, the struggle remains largely unreported. I thought it amusing to talk about work in this way because almost everybody I know who is working or has worked is playing that same game, deluding themselves and trying to pull the wool over other people's eyes about the nature of their work. And in particular, as I say, this constant low level warfare between bosses and their workers.